Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Voices for Nature podcast. My name's Chris Gambian.
And I'm Jackie Mumford.
So, Jackie, we're back in lockdown. I'm right in Plague Central here in the Georges River local government area. We've just today been told that we can't go further than 5 kilometres from our houses. How are you holding up through lockdown?
Yeah, that's right. Back working from home, wearing our masks at the shops, and every time we go out, pretty much, and yeah, really only going out for a daily exercise. Thankfully, this time around with lockdown, I have a dog, which is making life a lot more enjoyable.
Are you is it really more enjoyable, or is it another responsibility too?
Yeah, no, it's mixed. But he's great company. Yep. How's it going at home with 2 little children?
Well, I like to say we've got this great sort of co-workspace going. Unfortunately, they built a unstaffed primary school and preschool next door, and the kids in that school are just a pain in the neck, constantly interrupting. So hopefully the council can come in and sort that out. But no, my kids are doing well under the circumstances. They're doing pretty well. We've been taking them for a bushwalk each morning, and we're told that there's an echidna in our local park, and we've been out searching for the echidna most mornings this week. So it's pretty.
Oh, wow.
They're 7 and 4, so they're pretty cute, and they've been pretty stoic through it all. So I can't.
Yeah. Oh well. I hope you spot the echidna. That'd be a pretty great science lesson for homeschool.
And have you been watching the Olympics? Good time to be locked down.
I've seen some highlights. Yes, I've seen some of the gymnastics and some swimming, which is definitely keeping my housemates and I entertained while we're all sort of stuck here. Any highlights for you?
It's a bit of a ritual in our family at the moment to turn on the swimming when Aussies are going for gold. So it's been pretty good the last few days. The girls are absolutely obsessed with it. So it's all very nice. So who we got today? We've got a very special guest.
Yeah, really excited about today's episode, Chris. We're going to be speaking to Bruce Maynard, who is a regenerative farmer, and he's sometimes referred to as the lazy farmer. And we'll hear a little bit more about why when we speak to Bruce. But Bruce's farm is just outside of Dubbo, and he's a 4th generation farmer. His family's been on that property for a long time, and he converted it from conventional farming practices to this regenerative style of agriculture. So really excited to talk to Bruce and hear a bit more about his style of farming.
Now, people listen to this podcast from all over Australia and actually all over the world. For people who don't know Dubbo, give us a bit of a snapshot of what's Dubbo like. Where is it, and what's the story of Dubbo?
Yeah, so Dubbo is in New South Wales, in an area called the Central West. The other side of Mudgee, people might know the sort of wine growing foodie region, about 4 or 5 hours sort of west of Sydney. Dubbo historically has been a real sort of centre of the Central West, where farming families and has sort of really serviced the agriculture industry for a long time. They're also on the Macquarie River, so definitely have their fair share of environmental issues to contend with.
Lots of cotton growing, lots of wheat growing, lots of industrial sort of scale agriculture. So finding somebody who's trying to do more regenerative farming is pretty exciting.
So great to have you here, Bruce. Chris and I met Bruce in March when we were in Dubbo as part of a training weekend that the Nature Conservation Council was running with one of our member groups, Healthy Rivers Dubbo. And I remember, Bruce, at lunchtime, you went down into the car park of the venue where we were in town in Dubbo, and you collected a couple of leaves and you brought them back up to show us and the other folks that were there in the training room. What was on those leaves, and why did you go and collect them for us?
Yes, on the leaves were white and black necrotic spots, which is a fancy term for saying impact spots of synthetic chemicals, where the leaves were then dying outwards from those bits. I wanted to show people that the impact of the sprays that are being experienced through a lot of the agricultural areas are arriving well inside towns, not just from adjacent properties.
Yeah.
Bruce,
how far out of
town
do you think? How far out of town do you think those chemicals were coming from, Bruce?
Right, the industry training programs will indicate 20 kilometres or more in their, the industry participants will often talk about 5 to 10 kilometre spreads from point of application being something that's been visible. So their exact spread is still not really very well studied, but it's certainly the evidence in the landscape that it's very, very distant from where the application sites are.
Bruce, you get called the lazy farmer. Can you tell us a bit about what you do and why you do it?
Yeah, a little bit of my background. In the last 30 odd years, I've been on a sustainable ag, now often termed regenerative ag path. I've been fortunate enough to innovate a few things such as stress-free stockmanship, no-kill cropping and self-herding, all the three different approaches towards regenerative ag that we've done on our place. We've, over the years, planted a lot of trees on our farm, which is halfway between Narromine and Trangie, about an hour west of Dubbo in the central west. And yeah, in the order of 220,000 trees over our time and 350,000 shrubs. And that's been part of our journey. And I'm very, very fortunate nowadays to travel across Australia widely and going and addressing farm groups and working with folks and on the transition towards more sustainable farming systems.
What got you into more sustainable farming back when you did?
Partly difficulties in the late 80s. Yes, I'm that old, but I can remember the late 80s with high interest rates and even the first beginnings of changes in seasons were getting more difficult. And so that stuck with me, probably partly heart, but certainly head, in my view, just going more and more efficiently on the systems that we already had meant really a very, very obvious path that we would just have to be going pedaling faster and faster in the long term and getting results which were already evident across our rural communities, which is the long-term trends are for our communities to get smaller, for the profitability to be less, and the landscape to be degrading, all of which I think is our creative opportunity to take those trends in the opposite way.
Mm. What do you farm, Bruce, and the styles of sort of sustainable agriculture that you're talking about, is it applicable across different forms of farming?
Yes, it is. And I think especially if we rest on principles rather than practices, because what we would do here at Narromine is sometimes very, very different, of course, than what you would be doing in very different circumstances. But all of our efforts are directed towards re-establishing functional grasslands and open woodlands on the property here, while still making a business profit over that. So part of the tools we use for that is livestock grazing the grasslands so that we end up with more diversity. Things like livestock are a tool that can be used either well or badly. So they can be a degrading effect on the landscape, or they can be a diversifying effect. And then we also incorporate no-kill cropping over the top, which is a completely chemical-free and synthetic fertiliser-free way of growing crops within grasslands. So my whole journey is to try and reinstitute as much landscape function as I possibly can in my career time.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's happening with particularly the pesticide spraying and what some of those consequences are?
Yes, it's a very widespread problem now, Chris, and appreciably getting worse fast. So in the cropping regions of New South Wales, it's very, very apparent now that the vegetation is suffering, and widely. So in my view, this is a much, much bigger and more pressing problem even than land clearing, which is still largely unchecked, I might suggest. But this affects all vegetation, from the top-down impact, but as on an ecosystem basis, it's actually affecting everything right from the very base of the food chain. So some of the chemicals involved even go to the extent that they're algicides and so forth. So we're affecting not only the trees, but the whole ecosystem and water sources. And of course, this has the immediate implication that this is ending up on everybody's food. So even if a chemical degrades into its constituent parts, that's still ending up in the landscape and affecting the way the food plants and food animals, for us humans, are manifesting themselves in our food sources in the end. So it's something for all of us, and an easy one to miss, I might suggest too. If one were just driving through lots of landscapes, unless one gets a bit of an eye for, well, those trees and those vegetation communities are sicker than they should be, it's not immediately apparent until you go out of the cropping regions and those parts of New South Wales that have been cotton areas for a fair while. This has been something that's been noticeable for longer, but now with new generations of chemicals, it's starting to expand into everywhere where there's broadacre cropping.
So is this just a cotton issue, or are there other crops that might get a similar kind of treatment?
It's been predominantly a cotton area situation for well over a decade now, unaddressed largely, unfortunately. And but it is now extending the bigger broadacre sprays. Most conventional crops now are essentially run as single plant monocultures, so therefore everything else gets killed out. Now that's effective in producing large volumes of the food crop, and in New South Wales example, it's principally cereal crops like wheat, barley, and oats. But the consequence of that is that they get sprayed out many times during the year to kill out any other plant competition. And so over time, one thing for sure is if you keep on using one tool in a natural system, then resistance builds up. So therefore, harsher chemical compounds or more invasive ways of those being applied need to happen, because the plants that you're targeting are, of course, always evolving defences to the weed killers you're doing. And the difficulty on the broad for our whole society now is that these things are spreading so widely from where they're applied. It's one thing to take a view on, well, okay, conventional versus non-conventional ag. Well, if somebody's applying something on their place that can be, something somewhat of their business. But when it's spreading so widely and acknowledge that it is, then we all have a problem.
And what are some alternatives, Bruce? Because surely some kind of, control for disease and pests and things is necessary for these growers. What's the alternative to these sort of synthetic pesticides that you're talking about?
Yes, great question, because I'm not a purist or a zealot and say that we need to wipe out all of those tools. It's just misused, misapplied, and gradually trending in a direction of harsher chemicals, all of those things which are our real problem, and not being able to adequately apply them in ways that gets them to stick and stay. So an example nowadays is that there's significant amounts of spraying that gets done overnight with large ground-based sprayers in conventional fields. And that really wasn't much of an option back, say, a decade ago, because there wasn't the GPS guidance system. So it would have meant that you would be at high risk of crashing those flimsy vehicles into things overnight. Now, with new sets of technology, means that they're being applied at times where inversions of temperature means that even if these things are applied in appropriate conditions, then later on they can volatilize and move off-site. And so a really amazing example of that from Western Australia this year in the cropping zones, where a chemical there, which off the top of my head, I can't remember the specific one, but it's in the rural media there, where it has volatilized days, weeks and months after it's been applied. So it's been applied on fields, and then with certain moisture conditions, then it's got up and moving later on. So there's formulations really that we should be not really preferably using, I'd suggest.
And given that misuse is one of the sort of major issues, is there any kind of regulation, or who gets to decide how much and how you use it and all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, great question. Overlapping different authorities, which is, of course, one of the reasons that individuals or communities can't get any realistic action on this. So starting right at the top, the APVMA, which is the federal authority, decides what conditions any of the agricultural or veterinary chemicals get used in. So that's when you see on the back of a container the label directions for something like glyphosate or any of the other myriad things. They're the ones that set the rules. Then down at the state level, you have the environmental protection agencies or their equivalent, who are tasked with looking out for pollution events. But that is a difficulty in between those two spots. Then things can happen where people can, if you like, be adhering to label directions, but then damage caused, but the compliance authority is uninterested in taking the matter further because that's not really their remit. So it's quite a netherworld, and I might refer to the fact that at the moment the federal government has a major review on underway and just been presented to Parliament, and they're seeking to introduce legislation to make all the already lax laws even easier for chemicals to be brought in, and I think that is a development that should worry us all. I think we need these things to be studied in Australia in their context, because sometimes chemicals that are used in other countries will behave very differently in the Australian environment.
Bruce, Jackie and I were in Burke probably back in November last year, and one of the things that we heard up there was where spraying had had overspray into primary schools and things like that. Is that something that sort of happens a little bit? Is that a common problem?
Yes, that's been well. That sort of thing has been well documented for since the early 1990s. There were two in cotton areas. They've had form with almost bringing the beef industry to a halt totally, with two issues, one called helix and one called endosulfan, two lots of different chemicals that ended up in the food chain, and were only detected overseas, I might say, which is another sort of indicator of where our if you like, food testing regimes might not be picking up stuff that would be happening otherwise. So so many different press articles. It wouldn't be hard to Google up plenty of those incidents. Pretty much every cotton area, if people are interviewed one-on-one where they feel safe to make commentary, almost everybody has a story.
So if I got this right, I could be a certified organic farmer, but next door there's a farm that's using chemicals. There's sort of no requirements on my neighbour to tell me that they're about to spray, or that there's potentially some risk to my organic farm.
No, largely that's correct. There are a few smaller exceptions to that, and buffer zone label requirements and some restrictions, but largely you're painting the right picture. There isn't any reasonable amount of compliance or spot checking on our industry as a whole. So there would be nobody checking on me on my farm, for instance, tomorrow, that I'm actually mixing up anything to its label directions at all. If ever there's any inquiries from EPA or similar, it only goes on what my own records indicate. So I think we've got a basic structural problem there. It doesn't matter what view one takes on Australian farmers or anything else. 100% of us can't be wonderfully and doing everything right.
Yeah.
So
Given the sort of scope of the problem that we're talking about here, Bruce, why is it that you like that we don't hear about this more in the news and things like that, do you think?
Yeah, very difficult for us in regional centres now, and getting more difficult to even get stories out. I think there's some extremely large vested interests, obviously, that a lot of money is involved in the sale and use of these products. It's also hard to, when you're dealing with a problem that isn't a directly point source situation. So a hypothetical that if you and I are neighbours, it's not a situation where I have sprayed you. That's easier to identify. But when things are moving through the whole landscape, then it isn't just an individual misapplication problem when we've got this moving all around. It's more something more akin to secondhand smoke in a crowded venue being inhaled by everybody. Well, which smoker was it that did it? Well, doesn't matter if you're being impacted.
Mm.
What's a better system, Bruce? What if we were going to protect the veg that's being lost because of these pesticides? If we were going to protect communities, if we were going to protect those farms that are trying to do more regenerative methods and organic methods, what should the system be?
Look, I believe we have to start really at the basics. We're getting no compliance work, and our community groups that I'm involved with and individuals, we've been very, very sadly disappointed and let down by the various authorities that we can't even get to simple acknowledgement of obvious and readily visible damage actually being pollution events. So that's a starting point. You know, it's pretty galling. To use an analogy, if we were dealing with the police somewhere and they had vandalism on our house, and you're standing there saying, well, there's the vandalism right there in front of us, and the police saying, well, we don't know who caused it. Well, first things first, we've got to acknowledge the level here. Yes, to solve it all is going to be, unfortunately, overlapping authorities. I believe that responsibility probably will have to come via legal means, maybe, because I'm not sure that the companies and people recommending the use of these products will cease unless there's some, if you like, consequence for the damage that is readily apparent from those things. So, yeah, a long road.
Are any laws being broken currently, Bruce, or would you suggest that the laws need to be tightened to make sure that we do have better protection in place?
Yes, I guess it's I think the strong community view would be that regularly that's what they're experiencing, a break in laws, but there's not much to point out in terms of successful prosecutions. Once again, the authorities probably don't really want to be dealing with something that's more broad. They're much easier if they've got a point source, offender, that then they can paint it, well, it's only a cowboy or two that are doing the wrong things. But this is when it's widespread but not easily identifiable, well, the damage is still there. Something has to happen, but we would think that it does actually break some of the basic principles of damage and duty of care, because we don't even have any studies done on human health impacts of some of the chemicals potentially this past summer in New South Wales, the overspray that's been seen through the cropping areas could well be actually paraquat. And for those that have any knowledge of that end of the spectrum, that is a really worrying potential development, because that's a really, really nasty formulation for humans.
Bruce, what could folks that are listening tonight do to support the work that you're doing? And I know there's a number of people around the country that are working on this at the moment. Do we need to get in touch with our local MP? What's the most useful thing we can do?
Oh yes, I guess yes, please. any support that people can do about awareness. I think the pictures that can be taken out in these rural areas of the abnormally dead trees, because that's the thing you've got to identify. Just because you see a dead tree doesn't necessarily mean that it's been affected by chemicals, but those with any vegetation knowledge just compare going in and out of the cropping areas, but more particularly in and out of cotton growing areas, then it becomes pretty apparent. So any effect we can have on making approaches to the Minister for the Environment and so forth to enable us to get effective action from the in EPA in the New South Wales sense. We've been very, very disappointed. They've been taking an active role to actually fight the community interest in our view, which is really disappointing. It's a big statement to make, but we can find no evidence at all, and in any example at all, where they have adequately investigated pollution notifications in regard to vegetation. We can find none whatsoever.
Well, we'll certainly be raising that with the EPA and with Minister Keane, and we're very happy to support you and the work that you do. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Before we let you go, I should ask, how's the Central West going? We did an episode a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago now, on bromadiolone and the mouse plague. How's it going out there at the moment?
Yes, well, similar to pretty much every other mouse plague that I've experienced and everybody else. As soon as you get lots of cold and wet conditions, then the mouse situation tends to disappear. It's one of the amazing things that it seems to vanish quite often just as fast as it arrives, which is quite incredible. Who knows what the spring will bring, but certainly it didn't seem for a great many people out here in the bush that just assuming a bigger hammer was going to work when the hammers you're already using weren't pounding a nail in was going to be effective, and of course not supported by a wide variety of people with any knowledge of wildlife or ecology. That would have been a real disaster, I feel.
Yeah, good to hear.
Thanks so much for joining us, Bruce. Good luck.
Thank you very much for your time. Cheers.
See you later.
I'll tell you what, Jackie, there's a lot of stuff that Bruce has been talking about that has just knocked my socks off, in terms of like seeing those dead leaves when we were back in Dubbo, but just hearing just how widespread this impact is kind of extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a real worry, especially when we're talking about impacts on nature, but also human health as well. Like the fact that this is sort of blowing across into towns and schools, and the sort of widespread nature of these chemicals, and it's pretty scary.
So we're really talking about how do we have a sort of agricultural sector that is productive, that's profitable, that does all the things that we need agriculture to do. Let's not kid ourselves. We need farmers, we need farming. But how do we do it in a way that looks after the landscape and looks after people at the same time? I guess that's the big challenge. Isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's a challenge, but as Bruce sort of also spoke about, there are alternatives to this. There's better way of doing things. So it sounds like it's really just removing those barriers for more uptake of styles of farming, like Bruce uses the regenerative style of agriculture, and making sure that people, when they do use chemicals, that they do it in the right way. They're not, overspraying or overusing things, or not following the the proper directions for how these pesticides should be used.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, next week we've got another, while we're in lockdown, we're going to do as many of these podcasts as we possibly can. And next week we're having a great chat about Kosciuszko National Park and some of the big threats to that park going at the moment. I think a lot of people would be aware of the feral horse problem, but there's a whole new threat that has just emerged in the last few weeks, which is some changes to the plan of management on the national park that the state government are trying to push through at the moment, and there's a lot of concern about what that's going to mean for the very fragile ecosystem we've got in the park.
That's right, and given how popular Kosciuszko is, people love to go down there and visit and use the park in summer, but also in winter as well for skiing. So there are a lot of stresses on the park year round. So it'll be really interesting to hear from some experts on what these new changes to the plans of management will mean, because obviously we all want to be able to enjoy such a beautifully natural place.
Now, if people have got ideas for future episodes of the podcast, you should drop us a line. You can send us an email at ncc@nature.org.au. Very keen to hear your ideas for people you'd like to hear from and topics you'd like us to discuss. We just had the end of the financial year back in a few weeks ago, and we're very grateful for all the support we got from so many, literally thousands of people across the state chipped in, small amounts, large amounts, in between amounts, but it all makes a huge difference. We entirely depend on donations and support from individuals to keep our advocacy program going. We don't get any big sort of public funding or anything like that to do the work that we do by and large. So we're really grateful for all that assistance. But if you can afford to drop us a few dollars, we absolutely appreciate it, because as we always say, Jackie, koalas grow on trees, but
money does not. That's right. And, thanks to donors just like the people who are, watching or listening wherever you are today. It's really people like you who give us a little bit every month. That means that we can do this work. So it all makes a difference. If
you're watching us right now live on YouTube or Facebook, don't forget you can also download these episodes as a podcast on Spotify or on Apple or anywhere you get your good podcasts. And if you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify, remember that we put these episodes out live as a video on YouTube and Facebook as well. So however you stay in touch with us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.